Hello everyone, welcome to a synth ratings video where we are looking at Diversion by Dmitry Sches. This is a VST instrument that was released in 2012. The price is $169. It's currently on sale for the next few days until October 15th, so if you're watching this video right away, then make sure you check it out before the sale ends. This is an overview of the synth layout. It has 4 oscillators, 1, 2, 3, 4, which can then be routed into one of 2 buses, which can be mixed together or sent in parallel to the effects section. And of course we have a modulation matrix and arpeggiators and transgates and so on down here. We'll look at those in detail later on. The first thing we always start looking at is the sound sources available. The sound sources available in Diversion are 4 hybrid oscillators, and they are hybrid because you can choose from 3 different types of oscillators. They are sample-based, using built-in waveforms, or using what they call wavetables, which are not necessarily what everyone thinks of as wavetables, but we'll get into that later. You can also use user samples here, so that makes it interesting, especially when you have the ability to resample your own output. So you can manipulate waveforms or wavetables to a large degree and then resample everything and do it all over again. Each oscillator also has a sub-oscillator, and you can use frequency modulation and ring modulation between oscillator 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. So you can't use them between, for example, oscillator 1 and 3 or 2 and 4. There's a lot of options when it comes to wavetable editing. You can also do some very simple sample editing, like setting loop points, but that's pretty much it. There are also some granular features which are not that great, but we'll have a look at those as well. And finally, there are some interesting oscillator effects to shape the sound. To sum up, the sound sources in Diversion have a good number of oscillators and good choice of waveforms, and the oscillator effects can impact the basic waves quite a bit, creating great variety there. And if that's not enough, you can also load up user samples and resampling the synth's own output to create unlimited amount of waves. The sound quality is good, perhaps not spectacular, but you'll be able to get good results with this, no problem. The negative points are that the wavetables, as they are called here, are not true wavetables. You can't cycle through the waves as you would in a normal wavetable synth. But that doesn't mean that they're not useful. You just have to be aware that they may not be what you expect. The sample controls are pretty minimal. You can just set start and end points and the root key. You can also loop it, but it would be nice to have options like normalize, for example, here. The wavetable parameters are great, but they can only be edited in a dedicated editor window, and the worst part is that you can't target them with modulation. So you have to be aware of that as well. And finally, there is a granular mode, and it can be used to make some choppy sounds, but this is no full-fledged granular synth. It's just another option. And the rating for the sound sources is a 7 out of 10. Let's talk about the filter section. First of all, each oscillator has a mono filter built in, and each of those has its own post-filter distortion section with 7 different options. Additionally, remember that we have 2 buses that we can send the oscillators into, And both of those have their own filter section as well, which is the same filter, but it has a lot more options in the distortion and lo-fi mangling department. And you can also switch the distortion to be pre-filter or post-filter here. All the filters have 24 different filter types. The bus filters can be used in parallel, serial, or mixed modes. We're ready to rate the filters. On the plus side, there is a good selection of filter types and distortion types available. And we have some exotic filter variants like the all-pass filter, which you don't see that often, and I really like the sound of these. There are plenty of filters to play around with, and they sound pretty good. We rate the filters in Diversion 8 out of 10 points. Modulation options. Diversion has a fair bit of controls that you can use to manipulate the sound. First of all, there's the amplitude envelope, which is a standard ADSR, but it has curve control and also a nice clock sync. There are 3 more ADSR envelopes as well that can be freely routed, and they have the same controls as the amplitude envelope, which are clock sync, key track, velocity to sustain, and 2 decay release curve modes. There are 4 LFOs. One of them is called vibrato, but it's just another LFO that's hardwired to a few controls up in the oscillator section. All the LFOs are syncable with phase, rate, 11 available waveforms, some of which are pretty cool, and 3 different trigger modes. There is a Master Morph XY pad in the center of the screen, and we also have a separate XY pad for each oscillator. A random number generator is available as a modulation source. A powerful feature is that we have 4 MSEGs available. MSEG stands for Multi-Step Envelope Generator. In this case, we have 4 16-step envelopes where you can edit the curve or the value of each of those 16 steps. In total, there are 24 modulation slots, with 22 available sources and 48 destinations. Reviewing the modulation options, the positives are that there is a huge modulation destination list, and there are enough mod slots to really make it count. All modulation sources can also modulate effects parameters, which is something we don't see in every synth. There are 4 powerful MSEGs, and they have their own separate preset handling, which means that if you spend a lot of energy getting an MSEG to sound just right, you can just save that pattern and use it again in another patch. The negatives here is that modulation can't change waveforms or other menu items. Also, remember that you can't change the parameters in the wavetable editor window, which is a shame. There are no scalable modulation slots, which means that the amount a source affects a destination is fixed. It can't be modulated by yet another control. There are no velocity curves, so if you're a keyboard player, that might be a limitation to you. The oscillator XY pads are very limited. Usually they only have two parameters for one of the oscillator types, and you can't change the routing of those yourself. Finally, the XY pads are a bit small, so they're not as inviting to use as we might wish. The rating for the modulation options is going to be a 7. The effects section. We have a configurable FX chain with 9 to 15 slots, where the two buses each can have 1 to 7 effect slots in series but parallel to each other, and then we have 1 to 7 effect slots in series for the mixed signal. Let's show you how this works. There are 10 different effects algorithms, but you can only use 2 of each in your chain. And it's pretty standard fare here with the reverb, delay, phaser, chorus, etc. But you do have a grain shifter to shift things up. Pluses and minuses with the effects section. The positives, there is a decent variety of effects types. There are lots of slots and good routing flexibility with the way the chain can be set up. And you can also save and load the effect chains so you can reuse them in another patch. And the standout effect here for me is the reverb, which is really good for long synth washes. The negatives are some of the effects may be a little bland, they don't stand out in any particular way. The reverb, though I think it is excellent at what it does not have any other modes, so if you don't like that long synthy reverb wash, maybe you would like some gated percussion reverb or something, you're not going to get it here. Since there are so many effect slots, it would be nice to have more algorithms to choose from. There is a patch management system here as well. You can load and save single effects. You can save and load single effects, but you can't otherwise move them between slots. You can't drag and drop them from one slot to another. If you want to hear how that effect sounds on bus 1 instead of bus 2, you'll have to do a little bit of work to make that happen. Also, it's a disappointment that since you have this great effects chain preset system where you can load and save entire effects chains, that the synth is only supplied with 2 effect chain presets. You get the feeling that the developer should have made a little bit more effort in this area. To sum up, the effects section gets a rating of 7. Some positives and negatives for the ease of use. The manual is good and detailed, but you can't just press a help button to bring it up. You have to locate it in your file system and bring it up when you need it yourself. You can copy-paste and do separate preset handling for a lot of things here. The effects chains, the MSEGs, the arpeggiator, and the transgate. So you can reuse all those things between patches. That's cool. The MIDI learn is easy, and you can save and load the mapping of the MIDI controls. There are global buttons to turn off the arpeggiator, the transgate, and all the effects. Audition patches without those features turned on. Authorization is easy, and the final and perhaps best part here is that the modulation routing is easy, and you get also this helpful visualization of what the modulation is doing. The negatives here. One point is that there are 7 oscillator effects available, but only 4 knobs. So if you don't know that they exist, you might simply miss the final 3 effects. A pet peeve over here is that you can't change presets on the computer keyboard. That's a hassle when you're auditioning patches. You can't change the theme or the size of the GUI here, but it is decent enough for now. It might be too small in a few years as computer screens get ever bigger and with more resolution, but you can just about accept it as it is. Another strange thing is that the edit button in the oscillator section surprisingly changes waveforms in some cases. If you have loaded up a basic waveform and then click the edit button, the oscillator will switch to wavetable mode. And that might destroy the edits that you have actually made for that oscillator before. So be aware of that. You can load user samples, but they must be copied into the same folder as the factory samples are in. You can't just browse for them anywhere on your drive, which is an inconvenience. The ease of use gets a rating of 7. Let's take a look at the presets. There are 380 presets included in different categories, and the variety across sound types is decent. The preset quality is varied, but mostly good. There are more good patches than bad patches in there. For us, the atmosphere and sequence presets stood out, with the basses being the least convincing. If you tire the factory presets, there are some wonderful third-party banks out there and some freebies as well. There are too many presets that don't utilize the modulation options properly. For example, the XY pad, which is a quite central feature of the synth, is not mapped to anything in a lot of the patches that come with the synth. Also, there is the fact that because of the CPU usage, which we'll talk about later, the factory presets deliberately hold back on the number of features that they use. So if you only browse presets, you will never hear the full potential of the synth. One solution for this could have been to supply both the full and stripped down sound banks, but they didn't. The presets get a rating of 6. Features. The synth can have up to 64 voices of polyphony. You have master tune and transpose and per patch pitch bend range. You can only set the pitch bend range to be the same in both directions. In some synths you have the possibility to differentiate between the two, but not here. You have legato and portamento for those slides. There is a 32-step arpeggiator with the velocity, shuffle, tie, per note and global gate length, 1 to 4 octave range, and 7 different play modes. There is a transgate on board. There is 8 voice unison. We'll talk about that later as well. There is the possibility to increase the oversampling to 8 times in case you get aliasing on the higher end of your keyboard when playing some presets. There's also a brightness control to increase or soften the top end. I must confess that over here it's pretty much left in the bright setting, since that brings out the beautiful top end of the synth. For general features, the positives are that there is a decent arpeggiator on board. There is no MIDI out, unfortunately, so you can only use the arpeggiator for the built-in sounds, but that's fine. There's a transgate here, separate from the effects section. That's always good. You can resample the synth's own output, and you can also load up user samples. As we talked about before, this gives us a lot of variety in the sound source section with the amount of sounds available to us. And we also have to bring out once again that there are really deep editing options available for the oscillators. So you can just edit that oscillator till you're really happy with it, and then if you want you can resample it and edit it again. So you can do a lot of fun stuff with this. On the negative side, there is a lack of audio inputs, which is disappointing when there is a sampler on board as well as that pretty good reverb that I would love to plug things into, but we can't. Another thing that some people might be disappointed about is the lack of alternative tunings. You only have standard tuning here and you're stuck with that. Finally, of course, there is 8 voice unison on board, which may be a feature, but you're not gonna have a lot of luck using it, as we will see pretty shortly. The feature set overall gets a rating of 7. And here is the CPU efficiency test. Remember I talked about that unison? Okay, here we go. You know you're in for a rough ride CPU-wise when the manual contains its own chapter about how to reduce CPU usage. Following the tips in the manual does help. So You can also see this in the way that the factory presets are built, because the manual states that the presets are built to not consume more than a certain amount of CPU. And that's why, as we will see in our testing, the factory presets are doing pretty well. So let's take a look at the testing. The testing is done by playing a single sequence with only single notes, so they're monophonic, and duplicating that instance of diversion as many times as we can before the CPU hits the ceiling. So if I do this with a simple patch, say default patch, we get a 111 maximum instances. That's a one oscillator, no effects, no unison patch. And that works as well as you would expect. The test machine is an Intel i7 4 GHz quad core with 16 gigs of RAM, SSD drive, etc. It's not a top-end studio workstation, but it is good equipment that you can find in a lot of home studios, and equipment that should be able to run lots of VST instances with no problems. When we add a bunch of effects to this, 8 slots to be exact, we see that we almost halve the number of voices available. This is no big surprise either. Keep in mind that a patch rarely uses more than 3 to 4 effect slots, and here we are really piling it on. 61 monophonic instances of a simple patch with effects is pretty good. Let's move on to the complex patch, and here we use all 4 oscillators, we use lots of modulation, some active MSEGs, but still no unison or effects. And now we suddenly only get 8 instances, which is only 7% of the original voices available, which is a surprisingly low number. If we add effects to this, we see that it doesn't really change anything. The complex patch now has 8 effects piled onto it as well. It handles this pretty well, which again indicates that the effects section is not the big CPU killer here. There is something with the oscillators themselves. If we move on to adding unison to this patch, what do you think will happen? Well, the shocking result is that the same complex patch as before, with no effects, but full unison 8 voice enabled, will not play at all. The same thing happens with effects turn on, obviously. So the plugin uses all available CPU power without playing a single note. The manual states that unison will replicate the entire signal path, so we should maybe expect going from 8 to 1 voice here, but as you can see we get 0. So this is disappointing. However, the average factory patch does a lot better. The factory patches, as mentioned, are designed to conserve CPU, so the conclusion here is that they perform pretty well, but when you're designing your own patches, you have to take care not to run out of DSP. In conclusion, the CPU usage is disappointing, bordering on poor. The plugin barely managed to get its rating of 4. Overall results: due to the CPU usage, it's probably not the best choice if you're only going to own one synth. However, the sounds this plugin can produce can be fantastic, especially in some sound categories. You have a clear, bright top end and lots of features, and the plugin also feels stable. We didn't experience a single crash during testing. If you are the type who likes to get deeply involved with designing your own patches, you are going to get a lot of mileage from this synth. Just beware the CPU. The rating for overall results is a strong 8. Value for money is the final category, and at $169 this is a pretty high-priced plugin. There are no bundles available from the developer, so you can get this along with other products for a cut price. Discounts do occur. There is one right now until the 15th of October 2018. So if you're a synth-loving producer, you should demo it for yourself and consider picking it up on sale. If you produce a lot of chill out or ambient music, you love sound design and have a really powerful machine, you can buy this at full price, no problem. The final value for money rating is 5. That brings us on to the final ratings, and the diagram looks like this after we have scored it in each category. We see that the plugin has a pretty decent score all over, but 2 points for concern, which are the CPU usage and the value for money, the standout thing being the overall results produced by the synth. When we average out When we average out all the scores, we get a final rating of 6.6. And that is a good score. To wrap things up, here are some closing comments about Diversion. We feel that what this synth does best is evolving synth pads and atmospheres. Gated pads, complex sequences, and anything that can be soaked in reverb is going to sound good here. Due to the transgate, the M-segs, the arpeggiator, and the lovely reverb, this is going to be great for chill out, ambient, psytrance, psychill, those kind of genres. The synth does not do as well at fat unison sounds down due to the CPU usage, and we were never quite convinced by the bass sounds. So that's it, everyone. That wraps up our rating for Diversion, and hope you enjoyed it. If you agree or disagree with the rating given, then feel free to comment below, and make sure you subscribe to get the ratings from other synths as they are reviewed.